Mongolia, Nepal, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Vietnam. Thank you so much, Professor Roger. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mohammed, and a very good afternoon to everybody. First of all, many congratulations to the faculty for your celebration of 50 years operation, and congratulations to the team for organizing this event, which I know has been cooking for many years since I was first approached by my very good friend, Dr. Rami. So thank you to her and for the organizers for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. You're welcome to record my presentation and to post it online if you so wish. I have no problems with that. So I've been asked to speak for 45 minutes or so. I'd like to make it less than that because I think it's much more interesting to hear from the audience than from the speakers sometimes. So I'd like to give plenty of time for some discussion at the end of the session. So I have some presentation slides, which I'd like to share with you now. So I'm going to share my screen. And I hope my first slide is visible to everybody.
Not yet. We're still waiting.
Let me try again. I click share screen. How's that?
Yeah, it's open. Yes,
right. Okay. So this is my topic for today: the use of technology for development among indigenous peoples in Borneo. My first slide is by way of an introduction. Just to quickly recap, I'm not going to repeat what you just mentioned, Mohammed, but just to mention that I started working in the field of information and communications technology for poverty reduction and rural development in 1997 when I joined UNIMAS. And we started a project there to do with ICT4D, information communication technology for development, working with a remote and isolated community in Borneo. So I'd like to talk quite a bit about that, because that leads us well into the overall subject of information technology for indigenous peoples development in Borneo especially, but I think also there's applicability to indigenous communities around the world. I spent 3 years with UNIMAS, and then, as Mohammed mentioned, I was beginning to receive requests from various aid agencies to do similar projects. That for about 10 years, I worked in about 15 countries across Asia. But all during that time, I maintained my relationship with Sarawak, visiting frequently, and ultimately taking this position as a visiting professor at UNIMAS. And last but by no means least, I had the extraordinary honor to be made honorary member of the Kelabit community in Sarawak. You may not know the Kelabits are one of the smaller ethnic minorities in Sarawak. So I was, after the work that I'd done with them, I was welcomed into their community, something which I'm very proud of. So they gave me a name, Gatum Paran. So that's my Kelabit name, and I use that whenever I can. So to proceed, this is my agenda. The project that I began with my team in UNIMAS was in a place called Barrio, which many of you may know. It's a smallish settlement in the interior of Borneo, in the Kelabit Highlands in northern Sarawak. About 1,000 people living there at the time that we started the project. And the idea was to bring in information and communication technologies. So we called the project eBarrier. So I'll talk a bit about that. Talk a bit about what the consequences and the outcomes of that project in terms of replications in other communities in Borneo. And then we'll mention about Radio Barrio, another initiative, something called the eBorneo Knowledge Fair. And then I'm going to talk about information and communication technologies for something called Ethno Development, which I'll describe a little bit later on. And I'll end up with some of the lessons that have been learned over something like 20 years of action research in Borneo. So Barrio was a project that I started with colleagues in UNIMAS. The Barrio is very remote and isolated. At the time, it was very difficult to reach. It's still regarded as a fly-in community, although there are roads leading there from Miri. But if you feel like a 13-hour drive in a four-wheel drive vehicle across logging roads, I must say it's a wonderful trip because you really have a close encounter with the interior of Borneo. But that's the other way to get there, other than flying in from Miri on the Malaysian Airlines Rural Air Service. So at the time that I first visited there in 1998, the community really was starved of information. They had very poor communications, a very rudimentary radio connection with the outside world. And the population was dwindling. It was clear that people were leaving for all kinds of economic and personal social reasons once they'd finished junior secondary school education in Barrio itself. So the project involves setting up what we call a telecenter, which is a shared community center equipped with a few computers that have internet access. And we also had to provide solar energy because the community was off-grid at the time. And the facilities are shared by the computer, the computer facilities are shared by the community, and the center is facilitated by somebody with knowledge of how to work the technology so that they can train the residents, and also to help them find information that they can use that can have an impact on their daily lives. So the project grew. Eventually it was handed over to the community and they started to run it for themselves. It's actually won multiple awards, and as I mentioned earlier, was again replicated in a few other communities in Borneo. Now, Radio Barrio was another initiative that came later on in 2011, and this is a community radio station. A community radio station typically on FM broadcasts a short distance, 15 or 25 kilometers, depending on the topography. So it's a low power operation, and a community radio is really the community broadcasting to itself, and that's exactly what we set up in Barrio. So we had local volunteers were trained by volunteers from overseas. They were trained to use the equipment, and they devised their own programming to broadcast actually twice a day, 2 hours in the morning when people were getting up, and 2 hours in the afternoon, early evening when they were coming back from the fields. And this turned out to be very popular. Radio is a much easier sell than the internet to the community because they were already familiar with it. Many households already had radio sets, and they were very happy to listen to radio broadcasting in their own language. So typically, Mr. Stanley Ho there at the first radio manager, a picture of John Tarawe there, who people also know, I believe may be with us this afternoon, broadcasting local news and local announcements to the community, reading out the paper in Kalabit language. And there were many impacts on this in the sense of raising awareness of local issues to a wider audience. And because the community would always like to discuss issues, it actually accelerated the rate at which they could come to consensus by holding community-related discussions over the radio and taking call-ins on mobile phones, which were becoming prevalent at the time, and generating a lot of discussion within the community around issues that affected them. And in fact, the impact was so, I would say, so profound. The idea was, in a sense, so logical that we spoke to government officials in Kuala Lumpur and actually managed to get the media policy, government media policy, liberalized to allow community broadcasting, which had never happened before. So we're instrumental in changing policy in that respect. I have to say, though, the installation is rather fragile. It's subject to weather conditions. It's run by mostly using, at the time, solar energy, which is not that reliable. And when it went down, the community really complained. So we know they valued it, they listened to it, and they're anxious always to get it back on air whenever there were some problems with the technology. So to summarize 10 or 15 more years outcomes from eBarrio, they're really very wide, very profound, and really quite significant. Barrio now is a very different place from it was when we first went there. It's now like a sub-district of Miri. It has a lot more government officials. People are immigrating back into the community because they see economic opportunities. Of course, we don't claim all the responsibility for that, but I think the eBarrio project can rightfully and justifiably claim some responsibility for what has been really a revitalization of the rural economy there. So there are various types of outcomes listed out there. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. If you need more detail, it's all widely available in published accounts and elsewhere on the internet. You're going to have to search for eBarrio and you'll receive an avalanche of information. But related to enterprise, definitely generating incomes for people who struggled to make a living before, especially community-based ecotourism, which had a big impact in the highlands, not only for Barrio, but surrounding villages as well. Education, in the school in SMK Barrio, we introduced computers and connected them to the internet. And one of the unexpected outcomes, to use the internet, the students had to work in English because everything on the internet is in English. And the outcome of that was that their English language improved. So as soon as they went down to later secondary school in Marudi or Miri, they suddenly felt as though they're on a par with the other students with better English and even knowing how to use computers, which some of the other students from the urban areas didn't know. A lot of work went into recording culture, and that resulted in the establishment of a community museum attached to a Selly Centre in Barrio. That's attracting researchers from overseas, anthropologists and the like, historians who are digging up historical and anthropological information in the area and recording it in the museum. Rice production has been transformed, helped in part by the inflow of information and access to markets outside the immediate area. Remote consultations with the hospital have improved local health. The local clinic, which was a very small operation which we began, but is now quite a well-established and elaborate new clinic. It was the first people to regularly use the internet facilities at the telecentre to contact the hospitals in Kuching and elsewhere to get advice on treatments and on drugs that they could use. Social impacts, people were able to contact their families. I mean, there are incidents of when there are bereavements in the town and nobody heard about them until several days later in the village of Barrio. People were unable to attend funerals and the like. All that's finished now with the kind of communication that began with the eBarrio project. And finally, this idea of empowerment, which is rather vague, I know. I think we all use the word, but very difficult to really pin down as to the meaning. But one of the residents, I think, put it nicely, is that eBarrio put us on the map. And in that sense, I think it relates very strongly to this sense of general empowerment, especially enabling the community to engage in public debates that were affecting them, but which previously they didn't have access to. So just to mention the replications, after a couple of years or so working on the eBarrio project, government funded UNIMAS to set up replications in other similar locations that were chosen really for their isolation, for the indigenous minority populations, and for the hitherto being starved, basically starved of outside information, and not in that sense having very much agency with regard to any voice that they could bring to bear on public debates that might affect them. So these are the locations: Langlamai Penang community in Sarawak, Bacalalan, up next to the Indonesian border, Palau, Larapan, and Boyan in Sabah. So the next initiative I'd like to mention is what we call the Borneo Knowledge Fair. And this arose back around 2007, when we wanted to find a showcase for the knowledge that we were learning from our intervention in Barrio, to share it with other communities and to engage with them, with those other communities, as to what further research we could conduct, action research that is, that would address their priorities and aspirations for development and the problems and challenges that they face in ordinary life. So we hit on this idea of what we call a knowledge fair. We don't call it a conference, we call it an unconference. That's the term that you can look up, and it kind of flips the idea of a typical academic conference on its head, whereby you probably have a speaker, somebody like me, standing talking for 45 minutes and giving Q&A for 5 or 10 minutes to the audience. We flip that around and we say to the researchers who come up and say, look, you tell your story in 10 minutes. If you can't tell it in 10 minutes, you don't really understand it. But anyway, do your best, tell it for 10 minutes. And for the rest of the 45 minutes for your time slot, we'll have Q&A with the audience. Normally what we do is split the audience into groups around a table, and they debate certain aspects of the topic of interest. And after half an hour or so, somebody from each table stands up and gives their presentation from the community. And we've done this in order to elicit from them ideas for research that we could conduct, and then bring back the results, which they could then assess and put into practice if they like them. And that's been going on every other year since 2007, mostly in Barrio, but recently we shifted it to Bacalalan. And in fact, last year, because of the MCO and other difficulties, we held it virtually online, which was a great success. So we're thinking of doing it in a hybrid way this coming year, possibly in one of the communities in the Highlands, as well as going online. So we have a mix of local residents and people from all around the world, which we begin to attract during later sessions of the event. And instead of just confining it to researchers and academics, the idea is to hold the event in the Highlands, actually in a community. So we invite professionals, researchers, representatives of the private sector, policymakers and their advisors to come up into the Highlands for a few days, get a taste of life, typical life for Indigenous communities living there, so that they can understand their challenges, and the opportunities and the prospects for development, and also I think to overcome some of the aspects or some of the issues, preconceptions that they may have of life in these parts of the world. So we identify local concerns and priorities. Each year we review the outcomes from the previous year, so it's like a rolling agenda. And every year we try to bring in new issues as they become relevant. Some examples shown there. Now, there's a few pictures of that there, and we've a few years ago we prepared a book on the whole topic. It's called the Borneo Knowledge Fair, and this is a review of kind of a wrap up of some of the issues that we've addressed. during the last knowledge fair that we held in a village in community in Sarawak, in this case in Bakalan. And all these topics have emerged from discussions with the community. We don't go along and say, oh, we think we'd like to do some research in this, that, or the other topic. We just sit down and talk to the people, sit with them at night time because we're staying in their houses, talking to them over the lunch and as we walk around the area, and try to get a sense of the issues that they're facing, the difficulties that they have, and pull them together into a research agenda from which we can synthesize topics to carry forward as researchers. And the style of research that we conduct is very much under the control of the community. They decide the topics. They also participate fully in the research project implementation in terms of conducting the research, gathering data, designing the overall research, analyzing and synthesizing the data into something meaningful for the community, and then even assisting with some implementation and evaluation of the outcomes. Now, all this is described in this book, which I'm going to display to you. It's not your typical academic book. It's much more readable and much more approachable. So I think if I can bring it up here. And it's been published electronically. So it's in open access to anybody who's interested. So you can see it's full of illustrations, so you get a feel of the event, what it's like to be there. The English is very simple. We don't use too many difficult academic terms, and we illustrate all the sort of activities that we get up to. This is a picture of a community of a visual chart. This is the way we use the method we use to record the proceedings, which is helpful for people who wouldn't want to sit down and read a lengthy description. But these charts are drawn up during the conversations and the roundtable discussions, and then we pin them around the wall. So at the end of the day, they become a history of the event, and we just take photographs of them, or we keep the charts themselves, which we can take away later and pore over and analyze. So that's the way of recording the event. And then we use them to reflect the discussions back to the rest of the community. Have I lost my presentation? Okay, so that's the Borneo Knowledge Fair. And anybody who's interested will be welcome to join. We usually run it towards the end of the year, October, November.
Prof, we don't see your slides. Sorry, we don't.
Sorry,
we don't see your slides.
Okay, let me try again. Sorry about that. How's that?
Not yet. Yeah, it's coming now.
Good.
Yeah. We can see now. You can proceed.
Okay. So if you're interested to join next time, you'll be most welcome. As I say, it'll be virtual, so easy to join from your desk or living room. You don't have to travel up to the interior of Borneo, although I would recommend that to anybody who likes a little bit of adventure. Now, out of all this activity, there's, in my opinion, and opinion of a few other people, there's a lot to be learned in general about the situation with regard to the use of technologies for development for indigenous people, certainly in Borneo, but possibly more especially for the other indigenous communities around the world. The World Bank estimates something between 300 to 500 million indigenous peoples around the world, 75% of them in Asia. In Borneo, it seems to be about 5.86 million, something like 30% of the island's residents, a significant proportion, 50 ethnic groups and 170 languages. These figures you might not agree with them. It depends who you ask when you try to get an answer to these questions. But the key interesting point is that most live in the interior, in this area designated as the heart of Borneo that you may have heard of. That's an area of ecological significance that was stimulated by dealings between WWF and the governments of the three countries that sit on Borneo as a special area of economic significance. So the question is, what does that mean for the people who live there? And with the people who live there, what does it mean that they are now living in an area of ecological significance? I'd like to address that briefly, if I may, and point out that the Sustainable Development Goals require protection for the environment. Okay, so we accept the heart of Borneo is important in order to achieve that goal. A critical global source of biodiversity, something like 6% of the world's biodiversity can be found in Borneo, but increasingly that is under threat. And there's a lot of evidence, not only from within our own area around Borneo, but from other parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, that indigenous peoples are best equipped at preserving the environments. And ironically, when we look at climate change, we notice that the impacts of climate change are felt most in areas that tend to be occupied by indigenous peoples who actually contribute the least to its causes. So I'm talking, of course, about the rainforests, but also the Arctic, mountain glacial regions, low-lying islands as well. But the proviso here, arising from a good deal of research, is that indigenous people are only able to exercise effectively their stewardship of their environments if they're able to maintain their customary lifestyles. If not, then their relationship with the landscape and the biodiversity that it contains and the natural resources that can be found there tends to evaporate. They lose their customary lifestyles and their indigenous knowledge, and then lose their ability to preserve that environment. So the obvious corollary from that is that indigenous knowledge is therefore vital for effective conservation if we are going to promote this continued stewardship by the indigenous residents of threatened areas. And if we are to understand also the impact of climate change, and more especially the methods of adaptation and mitigation that people are devising for themselves. And we have a lot of evidence of both these issues coming out of our engagements with indigenous communities in the Ulu Barrio, in Sarawak, also across the border into Kalimantan, from events like the Knowledge Fair, where we uncover the issues and challenges and aspects of indigenous life in those areas that are being impacted by global warming. And that leads us into a concept which is known as Ethno Development. You may or may not be familiar with this term. There's something called Ethno Development theory. And it really relates to strengthening the ability of indigenous communities to devise their own style of development, as opposed to development that may be imposed from outside. Indigenous peoples recognized globally have had an awful history of impact from orthodox development, which often does damage to their lifestyles and pushes them into new forms of poverty which didn't exist before. So the response to this is this concept of ethno development. And it's a means of staving off ethnocide, which doesn't mean killing people, as you might assume from the word, but it's where indigenous cultures and ways of life are being lost. So what's being killed is the way of life, loss of traditional knowledge, and evaporation of traditional customary due to influences from outside. So typically, ethno development is self-led by the people who it affects in exactly the same way that we conduct action research and implement interventions in places like Barrio. And it occurs where the indigenous peoples are involved in creating a plan for their future development, socio and economic development. And that's exactly what we've been doing for the last 20 years in Northern Sarawak. So it's kind of nice to see that our approach, which was kind of intuitive, is converging with this concept of ethno development that's emerged quite some time ago, and which other people have recognized as a legitimate response to the problems that indigenous peoples have with orthodox development. So I mention that because the outcome message from what I've said, without going into too much detail, orthodox development is bad for indigenous peoples, which we've heard before. We all know about the problems of deforestation in Borneo, problems with building dams and clearing forests for oil palm plantations, and the impacts and effects, negative effects that that had on people who live in the area. We can argue, I think, quite convincingly that ethno development is sustainable because it requires preservation of traditional lifestyles, which in turn are the best method recognized so far for sustaining the environment and the biodiversity that it contains. So sustainable ethno development means environmental protection. And our learning is that this is an important factor to consider in terms of implementing SDGs, especially I think it's numbers 13 and 15, to do with biodiversity and protection of the environment for the governments of Borneo. The other learning that we've had is that many of the core characteristics, if you like, of information and communication technologies lend themselves very well to this concept of ethno development. Things like the death of difference, improved connectivity, much better access to abundant information. These are all things that come almost automatically when technology is provided. But the point that we make out of our research and out of our what we learn from events like the Borneo Knowledge Fair is that implementing technology, whilst technically it's often a challenge in these sort of areas, it's really only half the job. The much more difficult job comes in devising ways of finding uses for the technology which are relevant to the residents and which can be implemented and which have a positive effect on their lifestyles. And that's really the challenge, because what works in one village is not necessarily going to work in another village. One valley will have a set of priorities that doesn't coincide with the priorities in another valley. So you really have to tease out these issues through close engagement with the communities, by going back multiple times, by staying there, not just helicoptering in and out for half a day, and getting under the skin as much as you can to understand what the issues are, how to derive consensus within the community to work behind you in order to achieve a satisfactory implementation and ensure that positive benefits, desirable outcomes emerge. So as you might imagine, as we're all academics, we conduct research, and I just raise one research paper, fairly recent, that I can depict here graphically without going into a lot of detail. This is a fairly recent publication. We call it From the Margins to the Mainstream, Indigenised Development in Borneo with Information and Communication Technologies and its Contributions to Global Sustainable Development. I use the term indigenised development, same as ethno development actually. And this was recently published in the Journal of Borneo Kalimantan which is the journal of my very good friend and longtime partner, Dr. Pauline Vala, who is the director of the Institute of Borneo Studies in UNIMAS. And the idea that we're trying to put across in this paper, which I've tried to depict here graphically, is that indigenous communities, especially those that we work with, which are typically living in forests, adopt technology in order to implement ethno development. And the outcome of that, if it's done properly and carefully and sensitively through appropriate engagements with the community, is that traditional knowledge is maintained. Communities can record their knowledge, and which makes it easier to pass it on to the younger generations. And the outcome of that are eco-friendly lifestyles. Well, they're already eco-friendly because that's the way they've been living for thousands of years, probably. But the use of technology to record and transmit and even more widely broadcast traditional knowledge strengthens the ability of communities to maintain their eco-friendly lifestyle. And the outcome of that is conserving biodiversity and adapting to global warming. Now, the communities conserve biodiversity because it's in their interests, and they adapt to global warming because they have to. They don't have a choice if they want to maintain their lifestyles. And our current research is precisely around this issue of how communities in places like Barrio, Baclalan, and the others that I've mentioned, how they perceive the impacts of global warming and how they're adapting their lifestyles to deal with those impacts, and how, where they've been successful, how can we broadcast these adaptations to a wider audience, to other communities that perhaps haven't thought about them. And of course, information and communication technologies will have a major role to play in all that. So the final outcome, of course, is from all this, conserving biodiversity, adapting to global warming, and preserving the environment as much as possible, contributes towards achieving sustainable goals. So in summary, the lesson is applying ICTs to indigenous development within Borneo's rainforest communities carries lessons of global significance for the wider achievements of the SDGs. And this is where I give you the reference under there, and the paper is available on openly published. This is where I confess to some personal learning. And in fact, for me, you know, when we started in Barrio and those other places, a lot of us thought we were all going to bring in a lot of knowledge and spread it amongst these people for their benefit. But I think the balance of knowledge exchange has been more in the other direction. I feel as though I've learned more about these topics to do with conserving the environment, to do with community life, to do with development generally, than we've taught them about technology. And my goal now is to broadcast these messages as far and wide as possible so that other communities can achieve the same, especially with regard to the issue of ethno development or indigenized development. And I'm always asking, whenever I'm back to Sarawak, which isn't much recently, sadly, but I'm always asking, to what extent are authorities taking into account this concept of ethno development when they are making plans for the future of Sarawak, especially indigenous communities who live into the interior? Are they devising more plans on their own, sitting in the boardrooms in Kuching, or are they going out into the field, getting mud on their shoes, staying overnight, and applying this concept of ethno development? I don't know too much the answer to that. Probably people listening would have a better idea than me, but I think it's a question worth asking as we move forward towards Malaysia's application of the Sustainable Development Goals and its consideration for protecting its precious biodiversity, the last major rainforest in Asia, and protecting that. So this is my last slide. If people are interested, these are books that I've produced on the topic, which I've written or written part of. They're all available pretty much, some online, some you have to buy from wherever they're being sold. But if anybody wants any further details, I can provide that. You might imagine there's also a host of research that team over the years have produced from UNIMAS. Incidentally, the eBarrio project eventually gave rise to a research institute in UNIMAS called the Institute of Social Informatics and Technological Innovations. And they work with researchers from every other faculty in the university. And they produced a mountain of research, mostly available online, so fairly easily accessible. So I'm going to finish here. Thank you for your time and the opportunity, and I'll be delighted to take any questions or hear any comments that the audience may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Roger. It was wonderful presentation. Earlier, we heard about the theoretical aspects from Professor Irene, and now we saw how you practically implemented all those things using the ICT tools in Borneo. Before I open the floor for question, I personally have a few, both comments and questions. First of all, the term ethno development, sustainable ethno development, I found it, wow. It's something totally new to us, because all the time we had a feeling that if you try to introduce something new among the indigenous people, there is always a challenge or chances to deroot them from their traditional things. So this term ethno development, I found it something really interesting and totally new to me. So I just want to know, because you are using all these ICT tools, how do you fill in the gap of this language barrier? I understand that these indigenous people, they have their own language, and all these ICT tools come up with some main languages like English or French. So how do you fill in that gap of this language barrier, or did you face anything like this or no?
Thank you very much for the question. On the language, yeah, you're right. Almost everything on the internet is in English, but that's changing slowly. One of the projects I've been involved with is to record Collabic language using technology so that it can be translated more easily. I have to say I was very lucky, because when I went to Barrio, I found that I could be effective using English. Many people there speak English. The old people speak English because they grew up in the 50s and 60s when English was spoken in schools. The youngsters are speaking English because it's being taught in the schools. So there's a kind of a gap in the middle where I think for a while Malaysia kind of de-emphasized English language education. But there are always people ready to translate. And those people put me to shame, because they're pretty fluent in, let's say, 3 languages, and we're always able to provide translation for us. When we've operated the eBarrio Knowledge Fair, we often have people from several communities with different languages. So there's usually somebody able to provide interpretation. But that's one of the reasons why we use those visual charts, so that people can draw pictures, and it helps for those participants who are not familiar with the language that's being used mostly. But when there's a large number of people in the room, we're always using multiple languages. Most of the time it's the local language, I have to say, and that puts me to a disadvantage. But if I need to know something, I'm told it in no uncertain terms. So we get by, we get around it. It's never been a major barrier. We found ways to work around it. And there's still more that could be done. So thank you for your question.
I have one more question. How important, from your research, how important it was to have these financial issues? Because in our previous presentation, we heard that these financial issues or the investment is a serious concern, because some countries having the finance do not want to go for registration. Some countries wants to register do not have the sufficient amount of funding. So in your experience or from your research, what is your findings on this particular issue? Was that a serious issue? What do you think?
Well, finance is always serious. So, but as researchers, we have access to funding globally that is used to support research of the type that the funders like. And we've never found it difficult to construct an argument to support the application of funds for our research. And it's usually a strong argument. It doesn't mean to say that we always get the funding, far from it. But when we hit the right target, if you like, the right funder with a proposal for research that coincides closely with what they are looking to support, then we get funding that way. So I could name a whole list of international organizations, foreign government, aid agencies, and local government as well, Malaysian and Sarawak funding agencies, who have been willing, and we're very grateful for that, to fund our research. The problem comes later when a project finishes. Like, we got outside funding to install the radio station. Then we had to struggle to get resources to keep it going once the initial funding had dried up. So you have to be agile and creative. And we managed to find supporters who warmed to our idea, who caught the vision of what we're trying to achieve, and were able to stump up with assistance of a variety of formats. But you're right, it's always a challenge. But whenever we get the possibility to go forward, we do. And then when we run into problems, we start looking at them when we run into them, not that far before.
Thank you so much, Professor Roger. Any question from the floor? Please kindly unmute yourself and you can proceed. Or you may wish to type your question as well. I can read it out to Prof. Roger. Okay, Prof. Roger, because we have some more times, I have another question. The question is your experience in Borneo, and if you want to see it in a comparative setting, because I see you have been working in 15 more different countries, 15 other different countries. Can you implement your experience in Borneo in other countries also?
Yes, I've tried to, with various forms of success, varying success. The major lesson that I've learned, as mentioned earlier, is this need to engage with communities to devise implementations that are relevant to them. Now, so people have said, well, like government officials have said, well, how do we do that? And my answer is really, it's one village at a time. But that's not what they want to hear. Government officials want to implement what we might call cookie cutter programs, the same implementation for everybody. So, and I've seen this even in Malaysia, where we've had very close and good positive relationship with government. But governments have set up these PUSAT internet data and Medan info data centers. And they're all the same physically, which is fine. But they heeded our lessons and came to UNIMAS and said, look, can you help us train the operators on how to make these centers relevant for the community? And we've just been talking for half an hour about how to do that. So that's the kind of response that I've always been looking for. But in other countries, it hasn't always been the case. With some exceptions, Sri Lanka, for instance, the government there had a big program. They set up a government department underneath the Prime Minister and a big program to implement IT centres all around the country. But my advice was, look, engage with people who know the problems, who know the communities, in order to devise applications of the technology that would benefit them. Don't just assume that once the technology is in place, that it'll be put to good effect. And we're learning more lately that it could have the opposite effect, deleterious effects, when we talk about the dark side of information technology, which I haven't mentioned yet. But they heeded that advice and engaged with a nationwide NGO who had good relationships with communities and were able to help them use the technology and devise implementations that benefited the communities. The same in Bangladesh. I was involved in another government program there, huge program, hundreds of implementations nationwide, directly under the Prime Minister. And the approach there was to train government officials how to innovate. So they had an innovation department, and these were people who went out and looked for innovations within the context of local life as to how technology could be used to good effect. So it's really much more about just implementing technology. It's more about finding useful ways to make it useful for local communities. And that's not a lesson that everybody wants to hear, because it's not easy. Governments and bureaucrats look for programs that they can implement uniformly in a standardized fashion. And I understand why, because it's a lot easier to control, a lot easier to implement, a lot easier to manage. But unfortunately, that doesn't really work in the case of information technology and the information systems that people want in order to improve their livelihoods.
Thank you so much, Professor Roger. Anyone, any question, last minute question? It's been raining outside heavily. Any question? I hope you can hear me clearly.
Okay, my name is Jared. I'm the next speaker, but just want to ask Professor that how about the value? You know, I mean, the local community, the indigenous people, you know, how they look into the new technology for them, you know, whether they are reciprocate to that the new technology, they use it or underutilize it, or they are just in the beginning maybe they are interested, but I think it's not sustainable for the use of this technology in this kind of community. That is, I think, the one more challenge. I think to introduce a new thing to the if it's not aligned with the value of the community toward that kind of the new thing to them. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, right. Thanks for your question. Yeah, I must say I agree. In back in the 1990s, the early 2000s, the internet was kind of in its infancy, and it was a bit of a tough sell. Our first survey in Barrio, for instance, 100 households, there was only one that had even heard of the internet. Nobody was using computers. So there's a big knowledge gap to overcome there. But they took a leap of faith, and we worked with some people who very kindly allowed us to enter the community and work with them, and then help us promote the idea of using technology to better their lives. The particular tactic we used at the time was to start with the school, SMK Barrio. This was at a time when the government were promoting e-learning. And you remember the Smart School initiative? So we kind of picked up on that. Of course, the government program wasn't going to reach a place as remote as Barrio for some time. So we kind of brought that forward. And then the students got excited. We trained them how to play games, which is a great way to teach youngsters how to use computers. And then they went back and told their parents about it. So the interest spread. But we were very fortunate to have people working with us in the school who supported our idea and wanted to make it a success. Without that, it would have been very difficult. But then, of course, now, many years later, the idea of a shared computer telecenter internet is almost obsolete, although not completely, depending on how it's used. But what I just described was the beginning of a process of acclimatization and awareness of technology amongst that community. But now everybody's got a mobile phone. So, maybe the telecenter was not sustainable. We didn't necessarily intend it to be, because it was a research project that would have a beginning and an end. And we wanted to implement it in order to learn from it. So we weren't a government establishment trying to set up something in the long term. But the reality is technology has moved on very quickly in the way that it does. And the device of choice now is a mobile phone. And as long as residents can get access to the network, they're happy to use a mobile phone. And there's no sense of this being new now. It's just a natural part of background life. It's just there. And everybody's using it for whatever means they wish to. So, but come back to your idea of sustainability, where there are, I know there are still a lot of these PUSAT internet data around, certainly around Sarawak. But the government subsidizes all kinds of things. Things like sugar, for heaven's sake, which some medical experts claim is poisonous. Sugar and cooking oil and things. So why not subsidize information, which others have argued is the most valuable commodity of all? So it really depends on how you look at sustainability and what kind of products, services, or substances you want to put into the hands of the population that will deliver the maximum benefit. I'm not claiming that technology like this should be subsidized, but I'm thinking we should think about how subsidies work and what value some technologies can deliver compared to other forms of subsidy that we take for granted.
Thank you so much, Professor Roger.
Thank you.
I think we are, our time is over now for this session. And dear audience, if you hear me clearly because it's raining outside, may I request you to please switch on your camera so that we can take a group photo. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Raymond, I think you can help us to take the group photo. Raymond, do you hear me?
Yes, sorry, just give me a second.
Sure.
I have we have only about 21 people. Okay, hang on, let me. That's one, and that's two. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Roger. I hope we'll see you soon again in another session.
You're welcome. I hope so too.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to have our final speaker, last speaker, Mr. Gerald. Mr. Gerald Getoni chairs the advisory panel on formulation of Sabah biodiversity conservation strategy and action plans. The steering committee of the EU-funded program titled Tackling Climate Change Through Sustainable Forest Management and Community Development in Sabah. And he is the project board of the UNDP GPF funded project on biodiversity conservation in multiple use forest landscapes in Sabah from 2013 to 2018. In addition, Mr. Jetoni has managed several other multi-year projects related to sustainable development and biodiversity in Sabah, and has been the focal point of Sabah State for international conventions such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, Ramsar, and UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere Program, MAB. Mr. Gerald is the Secretary of Sabah Biodiversity Center, and he will be presenting on integrating science and traditional knowledge for sustainable development, Adat and the Tagal system. Mr. Gerald, the floor is with yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the Center of Legal Pluralism and Indigenous Law of for inviting me to give my view, my input on this topic today, traditional approach for conservation in Barrio and Sabah. I use a Taga system, and when I approached by Professor Remy to deliver a talk on the interfacing science and traditional knowledge, and this is the topic I can think of that can be a case study in Sabah. We are quite successful in Sabah, the implementation, but for this, maybe it's quite well known in Malaysia, the Taga system itself. But I think in the aspect of the traditional approach, I mean, the use of a the customary law to regulate it. That is, I think, the interest of the today presentation. Okay, as an introduction, I think conservation of biodiversity is a very complex, multivariate, and multi-level. You know, my thinking, and maybe people at large, is a different thinking, because as conservation is not a static thing. It's a very different community, different level of people, a different perspective of what is conservation all about, and it involves nature of issues of scale. You know, it can be a big catchment, or can be a small pond for conservation. Then a lot of uncertainty, the multiple stability domain, in human society influenced by value, perception, knowledge system, tradition, rules, in diverging societal interests that guide their thinking and action. That's why conservation of biodiversity, we look into not only the nature itself or the ecological aspect of it, but also the psychological aspect of the human nature of a human being. That is the actor of this conservation. And in implementation of conservation program, we need to align. Therefore, in implementation of conservation program, we need to align it with the local community, human and social value. That's why I think any conservation to be successful and sustainable, we need to align with the social in value of the indigenous people who are residing in that area. In the past, I think this is in the past, conservation was secured by enforcing the law to the people by trained personnel. I think we have some parks itself, forest reserve, gazetted as and no-go zone for the community. And I think they enforce it, you know, they strictly enforce it, and without thinking the socio-economic impact to the socio-economic of the people who are residing or depend on the resources for their livelihood. Therefore, strict rules of PAS has generated social costs, especially to the rural poor. Poor need resources from the PA to sustain their livelihood, and using it for they are using it for not only for the 2 or 3 years ago, but I think generation that is what they call factor that sustain their livelihood. They are already in part of the strategy, livelihood strategy for the people. That is the inherent first generation, and I think especially in the 50s, 1950s, we start establish the conservation area, protected area. Then I think these people are displaced, you know, and however, I think in the late 90s, we start under the IUCN 4 type of governance, namely type A. I think they established this kind of a governance. Then under type D, by recognizing is area conserved by recognizing the rights of the local people who are culturally connected and integrate their good practice into the management and strengthen their control over the access and end users of the resources, and enhance the knowledge and encourage informal innovation. Therefore, I think this in the late 90s, the shift of the management of the protected area, I think, have changed. They are more people friendly, centered, and they allow this people to involve in the management of the resources. And but I think for in general, I'm not so sure, but I think we are moving toward that. They allow people, they allow the community to participate in the management of the resources, especially the monitoring or whatever. And high cultural value of community have strong collective choice rule, and they have collective choice rules. You know, as you know that in the rural area, we are interdependent. They are interdependent, and there's a collective choice. I mean, the public in terms of personal public use is more important than personal one. Then by this regards, I think by empowering them, they are more concerned about the collective choice rules. You know, what is benefit the overall of them instead of what is benefit each one of them. You know, that is quite important, because personal benefit is not good for conservation. Therefore, if in the cultural high cultural value community, there is a tendency for village benefit. Everyone have benefited from this, and then I think when I go to the Tagal system, as a result in Sabah, in the past, I think in the late, I think in the last millennium, due to the negligence of the human and I think the overpopulation, I think people are more using the river. Then I think the disaster, flood, more often to occur, and on top of that, I think the river life, I think the fish and the aquatic life population also declined, because I think at the time people harvest it without any control. Some are being using poison overfishing, some are using electrical cord to get the most of it, and the villagers think how to overcome this, and then try to innovate. I think this is not a technology, new technology. It's innovate the idea of the past. You know, the Tagal system. The Tagal system been used in the past to control the fishing in the river, but is in the modern era. They try to use it to regulate the use of the river, and this system work when the Sabah state government, the Sabah government, empower the local community over the certain section of the river. This must be area based, which part this identify the river section that is suitable for this Tagal system. The system prohibit anyone to catch fish in the river that has been designated by the community itself. You know, must be discussed by the community until a time, usually 1 year, or sometime twice a year, for harvest of the fish resources. I mean, delay the harvest. You know, they don't simply catch the fish all year long, but I think everyone stop fishing for duration of time, but only for that time they allow the fishing activities. Then I think that's why they can get a lot of fish at one time. Then they allow the fish to grow bigger. Then river in Sabah is common right. I think that is normal. I think everybody can use the river. Even the outsider can use the river. And under Tagal system, local community living in that area are empowered by the state government under Section 58 of the Sabah Native Code rules and the Section 36 of the Sabah Inland Fishery and Aquaculture Enactment to manage the section of the river. This is the typical type of empowerment. You know, if now, because the river is a common right, anybody can come. You know, from the people from the other village can come to the river and fish the river. But by empowering certain section of the river to the community, give them right to protect the river. Not only to protect for the fish, but I think the right to cover the right of using for the fish in the river. Then one interesting thing about this system is any violation of the terms of the Tagal will be dealt in accordance with the rules of the native customary law and custom. This is a power under the native customary law, and I think this is recognized by the Constitution, the Sabah law, and cannot be challenged by other third party. I mean, if the power given to the village head, then I think the penalty is quite heavy. Sometimes quite heavy, can become to 2,000, 3,000 worth of maybe animals or whatever kind of penalty. But I say it's quite heavy. But it's not challenged by the third party. Then the one thing about this is everybody are empowered to oversee the river. The law is adhere. You know, everybody if you found someone to violate this prohibition, he can complain to the village heads. Then village heads can call for the hearing, and if then can empower by the law to that cannot be challenged by the third party to whatever. I'm not so sure about what is penalty, but the implementation is something like this. start with the request from the village itself. Then after all the documentation, and because this is for fishery, then I think they have to sign the MOU with the Department of Fisheries Sabah, with the GKK. I think the old system, the new one. Well, I'm not so sure what's the name, but I think the Village Development Committee. And we have to consider other users. If there's other users for the river, sea, they're still using it for the water, consumption of water intake, I think they have to consider. If there is hydroelectric there, they have to consider that. And through some process, SOP, they have to limit, must be because I think you have to identify how feasible the river to be Tagal, you know, and okay, they have to share the Tagal system to everyone. Every village must be agreed and commit to all the condition of the Tagal system, because I think if you sign the MOU, there's a commitment by the villages themselves, and limit the facility assistance of the support by the Department of Fishery or other district officer to the zoning, because people are looking for that opportunity also, because there's some incentive from the department and the district level. And zoning, in one stretch of the river, the Tagal, not all can be fished. Some are used for protection, allow the fish to lay the eggs or what. Then the enforcement and the penalty have to address in the SOP. Then that is must be agreed by the under the MOU. And the system is emulated in Sarawak, the system Tagang and the Pahang, but I think there's a mixed result of the success. Maybe due to for me, it's maybe due to the absence of this the native customary law, that to enforce it, you know, is a very what it calls cost effective, you know. If you bring the court, the people to court, you know, I cost you how much, you know. But I think by this system, very cost effective. Not much legal fee involved, but I think the village has a power to do that. It cannot be challenged by the third parties. That's the other thing aspect of it. And in Sabah, we try to use it for the forestry Tagal, you know, allowing certain taking of the forest produce, but in the sustainable manner. And there's the attempt to do this, replicate it for the forest Tagal and wildlife, you know. This is very interesting. Then we are try to attempt using it for the wildlife to prevent this illegal hunter. And I think there's another innovation for this Tagal system. Other than that, Tagal has been some of the areas, I think the Tagal system promote for tourism, you know. And I can put two places here. One is in the Kampung Luanti Ranau, you know. The village can get around 1.5 million ringgit revenue from the Tagal system, because I think due to the strategic location of the area, because the tourist buses is past the area, and the villages itself can get around 1.5 million of revenue a year, and I think it's quite substantial for the village economy. And in Kibinut, Pinampang is quite near to Kinabalu. It's a Taga system, and I think they managed to during good time for tourism provide employment to the villages. And other than that, I think it's support the socio-economic of the villages. And this is some of the tourist spot that can be product of Tagal system for tourism. And this is another one. And this where we can use the clean water instead of fishing, allow fishing, they can use it for promote what they call outing tourism for the local. Then this is one of the areas where I know I'm familiar with. And as a conclusion, I think the system not only managed to conserve fishery as a whole, because I think the intention is for the villages is to get the good fish, bigger fish, and sustainable fishing, but also improve the livelihood of the community. But on top of that, the biodiversity and the quality of the water in the river has improved significantly. This is due to the recognition of the government of the Tagal system, and I think all development around the area have to be considered this existence of this Tagal system, Tagal area, and one of them is like EIA. If any development, housing development near the Tagal system, you have to conduct EIA, and EIA have to look into Tagal is one of the, you have to consider Tagal one of the factor you have to into consideration, mitigate the impact to the development to the Tagal area. And one aspect that make this area, as I mentioned earlier, effective in Sabah, maybe only in Sabah, I'm not so sure in other area in Malaysia, but is the Native Court Enactment 1992, which is an integral part of the legal system in Sabah, and it governs all aspects of conflicts between native. That's why I think it's very cost effective and could not be challenged by the third party. I will mention that. This is the, I think for me, this is the main part why the Tagal system can be enforced in the modern in modern time in Sabah, because of this. We still have this law that overseeing this, and cannot be challenged. Anybody have to, what the decision of the foreigner, whatever, you have to be follow these rules and judgment by this Native Court Enactment 1992. And one lesson learned, I think, empowerment of the local must be within the shadow of the law. You cannot just allow them to control the river without any monitoring by the other laws. You know, for this case, we're using this fishery law, and if you allow that to happen, the self-organization is a socio-political, because the community have the political, their own politics within the community. Then I think very difficult to handle, and therefore we need to empower them within the shadow of the any laws that are appropriate. With that, I think I end my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Joel. It was a wonderful presentation, and we learned so many new things. Any question from the floor? Any local chef having any question relating to the presentation or Sabah biodiversity. I think the presentation was very clear and no question. Okay, so once again, I would like to request the audience if you can kindly switch on the camera and let us take a group photo. Let us take a group photo so that we can use it for our promotional purposes. Raymond, if you hear me, kindly assist us.
Yes. Yes, taking now. Just give me a second. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a wonderful, engaging session today. And with that, we're going to say goodbye to you for today. But tomorrow we'll start at 2 p.m. sharp Malaysian time. And thank you once again for your presence, and would like to see you again tomorrow. See you. Bye. Thank you, Gerald. Once again, thank you, Professor Roger Harris, for your time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.